Okay, so ready to dive into something a little, well, unnerving. Captivating, too, though. It's Curtis Yarvin's idea of the cathedral.
Ah, Yarvin always gets people fired up.
He does, and for good reason, I think. But forget any actual buildings here. This cathedral is way bigger. It's more like, how do we even say this? That feeling we get about how information works now.
That there are these forces at play we can't quite put our finger on. It's like trying to explain the rules of a game you didn't know you were playing.
Exactly. And Yarvin's trying to hand us the rule book. He's looking at these institutions, universities, the media, the big dogs, and saying they're all connected in this way that influences what we know,
Right.
even without some evil plan.
It's fascinating, right? Because on the surface, you've got Harvard, you've got the New York Times, all these separate entities. But Yarvin's arguing they're not as separate as they appear. This interconnected web, this cathedral, it subtly shapes the ideas that gain traction, the ones that get amplified.
Right. Like it explains how everyone seems to be on the same page about these really complex issues. It's like, come on, did we all get the memo?
Yeah.
Yarvin would say, well, yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
He points to places like, as you said, Harvard, Yale, the Times. Those institutions were conditioned to see as the gold standard.
The arbiters of truth. And he's not saying they're sitting in a smoky room, twirling their mustaches and deciding what the narrative will be. Instead, he's saying this alignment is more like a natural consequence of how power operates. A filtering system, if you will, where only certain types of ideas can thrive.
So it's not always that the best ideas win out, but rather the ones that fit within this existing structure, this cathedral.
It's less about good ideas versus bad ideas, and more about which ideas support the existing power structures, and which ones challenge them. Yarvin uses this analogy of dominant versus recessive ideas, almost like genes. Dominant ideas, the ones that support the status quo, well, those get amplified. The recessive ones, the ones that challenge those in power, they struggle to gain traction.
So if an idea makes those in charge uncomfortable, it's probably not going to get a lot of airtime, regardless of its validity. And we're not just talking about politics here, are we?
Absolutely not. It's everywhere. Think about how certain perspectives get labeled as fringe or even dangerous, even if they're well-argued, thoroughly researched.
It's like that saying, it's easier to fool people than to convince them they've been fooled.
Exactly. And Yarvin, well, he has this way of explaining things that's both a little jarring and impossible to ignore. It's like, are you ready for this? He calls it the sewage metaphor.
Okay, our listeners know we don't shy away from the messy stuff. Hit us with it.
All right, so imagine a pristine lake. Crystal clear, a perfect little ecosystem. Now, picture a factory nearby just dumping waste into this lake. Over time, what happens? The whole ecosystem gets thrown out of whack, right?
Stably.
Right. It becomes a breeding ground for things that thrive in that polluted environment while everything else struggles to survive. Yarvin says this is what happens when you have these massive bureaucracies, governments included, leaking power and influence into the cathedral.
Okay, so we're not talking about literal sewage here. It's more like political agendas, funding biases, these subtle ways power can distort how information flows.
Right. It pollutes the intellectual environment, creating conditions where only certain kinds of ideas can flourish. And the cathedral, this network of universities, media outlets, think tanks, they become this kind of echo chamber where those dominant ideas, the ones that align with the powers that be, get amplified and perpetuated.
So what you're saying is that it has huge implications because it challenges our whole understanding of where truth even comes from. If we're only exposed to a limited range of perspectives, are we truly informed? Or are we just absorbing what the cathedral has decided is acceptable?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's a chilling one.
It really is. And I'm willing to bet some of our listeners are thinking, okay, this cathedral thing, it's interesting and all, but what does it actually look like in the real world?
Well, Yarvin takes us on this trip almost to two made-up countries, Mundana and Mutopia, to show us how this works.
Right. It's not just theory. He makes it real, kind of scary even.
A little bit, yeah. Like all good thought experiments, there's this dark humor to it, makes you think.
So indulges Mundana, Mutopia. Who are these folks and why should we care?
Okay, so Mundana, picture like Tsarist Russia, okay? Oppressive monarchy, secret police everywhere. You can't say anything against the powers that be.
Got it. So totalitarianism, basically.
Exactly. Now, flip side, Mutopia. This is like the Western ideal, right? Liberal democracy firing on all cylinders. Free speech, individual rights, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, so total opposites. Where's he going with this?
Here's the curveball. Yarvin says that, at least at first, the dissidents, the people whispering dangerous ideas in Mundana, they actually have better ideas than the intellectuals in Utopia.
Whoa, wait, really? You'd think freedom of thought equals better thinking, right? Why is he saying the oppressed folks are ahead?
Because the stakes are higher. In Mundana, one wrong word can land you in deep trouble. So those dissidents, they can't afford sloppy arguments. Their ideas are tested constantly.
Makes sense. It's like the survival of the fittest idea in a weird way.
Right. Only the strongest ideas survive. Now, Mutopia, remember the sewage? Power's leaked into the cathedral, right? So intellectuals, professors, journalists, they're rewarded for fitting in with those institutions.
Not rocking the boat too much.
Exactly. It becomes about getting published, getting invited to the right parties, not necessarily challenging the status quo. Conformity over truth-seeking, almost.
So opposite of Mundana, where only the truly dangerous ideas are worth risking to share.
Exactly. And even then, they're whispered. In Utopia, it's the challenging ideas that get silenced, because rocking the boat is BAD for your career.
Okay, I see the contrast, but neither sounds great for actually pushing ideas forward. So what's the point Yarvin's making with this Mundana-Mutopia showdown?
He says that in the end, both systems end up with the same problem. A ruling class more worried about staying in power than serving the people. Stagnant, self-serving, despite the different ways they control information.
Hold on, Utopia, the supposed Utopia, ends up as bad as oppressive Mundana. We're going to need you to break that down for us. That's a doozy. So we've got these two contrasting societies, each with its own way of controlling information. But ultimately, both Mundana and Mutopia end up with out-of-touch ruling classes, more concerned with holding on to power than serving the people they're supposed to represent. How does that happen? How does this supposed Utopia go so wrong?
It's that sewage metaphor in action again. Remember how we talked about power leaking from bureaucracies? Well, in Utopia, it's like the government has outsourced its responsibility to the cathedral, relying on those institutions to shape policy and control the narrative. Over time, this creates a dangerous feedback loop. The cathedral becomes increasingly detached from concerns of everyday people. It becomes more about signaling its own virtue, reinforcing its authority, than actually solving real-world problems.
So it's like they get trapped in their own bubble, surrounded by yes men who tell them what they want to hear, not necessarily what they need to hear.
Exactly. And because they've outsourced their critical thinking to the cathedral, the leaders in Utopia become blind to the flaws in their own system, trapped by those dominant ideas no one dares to question.
Which brings us back to that question we posed earlier. Where do we see this dominant versus recessive idea dynamic playing out in our own world? It's easy to think about it in abstract terms, but what are some concrete examples where challenging the accepted narrative can get you labeled as problematic, as we were saying before the break?
The examples are everywhere once you start to look for them. Take the field of health and nutrition. We're constantly bombarded with information about what to eat, what not to eat. But how much of that information is actually based on solid science? And how much of it is driven by the agendas of powerful food companies or ideological biases within the research community itself?
That's a great example. It's like we're told to fear certain foods, embrace others, but the science behind those recommendations is often far from settled. And if you dare to question the prevailing wisdom, well, you're immediately branded a heretic.
Precisely. And it's not just about food. Think about the way history is taught. Which historical figures get celebrated and which ones get demonized? Whose stories are told and whose stories are silenced? These aren't just academic questions. They shape our understanding of the past and, by extension, our vision of the future.
It's like we're all given a pair of glasses with a particular prescription, and we're told this is the only way to see the world clearly. But what if that prescription is wrong? What if it's actually distorting our vision, preventing us from seeing things as they truly are?
That's the danger of the cathedral, of any system that becomes too monolithic, too resistant to outside perspectives. It creates a kind of intellectual myopia, where only certain truths are deemed acceptable, while others are ignored or suppressed.
So what's the antidote? If even those institutions we associate with reason and progress can fall prey to this kind of groupthink, how do we navigate this complex information landscape? How do we avoid getting swept away by the currents of those dominant narratives?
It starts with awareness, simply recognizing that this cathedral exists, that it subtly influences our thinking, even if we don't realize it, is a crucial first step.
Like waking up from the Matrix. Once you see the code, you can't unsee it.
Exactly. And once you see it, you can start to question it. You can look for those cracks in the narrative, those alternative perspectives that challenge the comfortable consensus.
So it's not about rejecting everything we hear, but about becoming more discerning, more critical in our thinking.
Absolutely. We need to diversify our sources of information. Don't just rely on the usual suspects, the big name institutions, the mainstream media. Read widely, explore different perspectives, especially if they make you uncomfortable.
It's about becoming your own curator, your own fact checker. Don't just accept things at face value, no matter how credible the source might seem.
And that brings us to Yarvin's proposed solution to the problem of the cathedral. As you can imagine, it's just as provocative as the rest of his thinking. He argues that since bureaucracies inherently leak power, the only way to prevent the formation of a cathedral is to have a system where power is consolidated, not dispersed. And the system he proposes is a monarchy.
A monarchy. Talk about a controversial solution. That's certainly not going to be everyone's cup of tea.
To be fair to Yarvin, he's not talking about your tyrannical, iron-fisted monarch. He envisions a benevolent ruler, someone who can see through the fog of the cathedral and make decisions based on what's truly best for the people.
It's an intriguing idea, a bit out there. But I think it raises an important question. Even if we set aside the whole monarchy debate, is any system, even a supposedly ideal one, truly immune to this concentration of power, this tendency to favor those dominant narratives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Are we destined to forever grapple with the influence of the cathedral, regardless of how our societies are structured?
It's a bit of a head-scratcher. But maybe that's the point of all this. Maybe Yarvin isn't trying to give us a definitive answer, but rather to spark a conversation, to get us thinking critically about the systems that shape our world.
And on that note, I think it's time to leave our listeners with one final provocative thought. What if the real solution to the cathedral doesn't lie in any particular system of government, but in our own individual capacity for critical thinking? What if the best defense against those dominant narratives is simply our own willingness to question, to challenge, to demand more from the institutions that shape our lives?
On a thought-provoking note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into Curtis Yarvin's Cathedral. We always encourage you to keep exploring, keep those brain gears turning. Until next time, happy listening.